Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel, and we'll start with the Mishnah 5 lines down from the top. HaPesach achatas sheshchaton shelo lishmon. So out of the various categories of karbonos, there are two in which if the avoda was done shelo lishma, the carbon is absolutely possible. And that is Pesach and Chatas. Kibel v'holach v'zark shelo lishmon. So this is pretty simple, straightforward. It gets a little more complicated in the rest of the Mishnah, but this part is simple. That if any of the avodos, whether it be Kabbalah after Shechita, which is obvious because we had already Shechita in the first part of the Mishnah, or Holacha, or Zrika, if any of the above were Shalol Lishman, the carbon is possible. Now the Mishnah gives a more complicated case. O lishman v'shalol lishman, o shalol lishman v'lishman. Meaning he began the avoda in one mindset and then he completed it in a different mindset. And it works in both directions. He either began the avoda lishma and then he shifted to shalol lishma, or the reverse. He already began with shalol lishma and then he got to lishma. It's possible, meaning the entire avoda has to be lishma, because the psul of shalol lishma is a psul in the carbon, a machshava haposeles. And it doesn't matter where and at what point in the avoda he had the machshava haposeles. Once that machshava haposeles registers, then it passes the carbon. And now the Mishnah gives examples. Keitzad lishman v'shelo lishman. He opens up with the avoda of the carbon Pesach for the sake of the carbon Pesach, l'shem Pesach. Fine. Then he shifts midway and he has in mind l'shem shlomim. So that l'shem shlomim is a machshava poseles and it makes the carbon Pesach possible. What's the reverse case of shalol lishman lishman? That's a case where he started l'shem shlomim, l'shem Pesach, he ended with l'shem Pesach. Carbon is possible. Now, a summary that the Mishnah offers for this Mishnah is Zevach nifsal be'arba dvarim, Shechita v'kibul damim, Yehiluch u'bezrika. So any of the four avodos, if there was a machshava poseles in the case of a Pesach or a Chatos, it passes the carbon. Now we have a machlokes in which the Mishnah now in the Sefer presents a dissenting view, and that is Rabbi Shimon. He's machshe behiluch. Out of the four avodas, he would subtract one, and that's hiluch. Shaya omeri efsher below shchita shebelo bekabolo bezrika, aval efsher below hiluch. And when would it be possible to? Oh,
sorry, my computer just started playing.
Yeah. So when would it be possible to circumvent the need for holochas adam? That would be in a case where he shechted the carbon right next to the mizbeach. He's makabel adam in a kli, and then he zorik the dam from the kli onto the mizbeach. He didn't need any holacha whatsoever, and therefore holacha, according to Rav Shimon, is in a separate category. Namely, it's an avoda that is possible to avoid, right? It's let's call it, it's dispensable. You can imagine a scenario where there is no halacha. So halacha is not a full-fledged avoda. Later on, we're going to have to talk about halacha bizarre, a non-kohen, according to Rav Shimon. And now we continue in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, hamahalach b'mokum shu tzorach lahalach, machshava poseles. B'mokum she'eno tzorach lahalach, ein machshava poseles. Rabbi Eliezer comes up with a kind of a compromise shita between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon, and he says it all depends. Right now, when the Kohen is bringing the dam to the Mizbeach, does he need to be molechit? If the answer is yes, then a machshava poseles will pass the carbon. But if it's a case where Eino tzarech lahalech, where he could simply avoid halicha, if he decides to walk and get closer to the mizbeach, then there is no machshava poseles because the entire walking here was unnecessary. Now we start the Gemara. Kabbalah mi pasla. What about the Chachamim who argue with Rabbi Shimon, and they hold that if there was a machshava poseles during Kabbalah, that would passel of Vatanya. We have a brisa that says v'krivu, and this is a pasuk in Parshas Bo, I believe. Let me just double check that. I'm looking in the Torah or over here. V'krivu, he says the following: V'shachad es ben abokel v'nei Hashem v'krivu b'nei Aaron hakonis Adam v'yikra perik aleph zu kabolas Adam. So the word v'krivu doesn't refer to actually bringing the dam onto the mizbeach, but rather it refers to receiving the dam after the shechita. Atomer kabolas Adam enu el zrika. Maybe when the Torah says v'krivu, it means get the dam close onto the mizbeach, which is called zrikas hadam. Well, guess what? The pasuk itself explicitly mentions zrika elsewhere. It says kshu omer v'zarku harei zrika omer. Right at the end of the pasuk, it says v'zarku es hadam. So that's referring to zrika. The beginning of the pasuk, therefore, has to be referring to kabbalas hadam. Omani mekan v'krivu zu kabbalas hadam. Now the pasuk says, "V'krivu b'nei Aaron hakohanim sadam, shetehei b'kohen kosher b'kli sharis." That means that kabbalas hadam requires a kohen. He's not a balmum, and he has to be mekabel hadam in a kli sharis. Now it's not absolutely clear where the Mishnah, where this brisa derives, Kohen kosher. It just says b'nei Aaron hakohanim. That's all it says. It's nothing more innocuous. So he quotes a drasha that says they have to be bikuhunasam. Kuhunasam means they have to be kosher. They can't be a cholol, can't be an onain, and they have to be wearing the begadim, the big day kahuna. And also they have to be mekabel adam and kli sharis. Omer Rabbi Akiva minayin lekabel shalotei ela b'kohen kosher ubekli sharis. And it seems that even Rabbi Shimon could accept this principle. That's the impression I get. That even though a machshava poseles will not impact on Kabbalah, as we said, because you could avoid Kabbalah and dispense with it, but nevertheless you still require a kohen kosher. So where does Rabbi Akiva derive this from? Nemar kan b'nei Aaron. He has a gzeira shava between b'nei Aaron here in Bamidbar. V'nemar lahalon el shmos b'nei Aaron hakohanim hameshuchim. So that this pasuk in Bamidbar also mentions b'nei Aaron. Malahalan b'koin kosher b'kli shoris, afkan b'koin kosher b'kli shoris. The pasuk that speaks about the qualifications of a kohenim refers to Elazar v'Tamar the bnei Aaron who survived after their brothers died, and they were full-fledged kohenim ksherim. Now, how do we know that the Kabbalah Saddam has to be in a kli shoris? So if I read Rashi correctly, Ira, the impression I get is that Bakli Sharis here is not referring to the Mizrach in which he accepts the Dam, it's referring to the Big Day Kohen,
Hmm.
and those are called Kli Sharis. So now we're assuming, based on this last brisa and Rabbi Akiva, that the status of Kabbalas Hadam is equal to that of all the other avodos. Rabbi Tarfon says, I don't get it. Akapeches bonai, this is kind of a klola. Im lo shamati lahavchin hefresh bein Kabbalah Zrika. I know there is some sort of fundamental difference which I heard from my rebbeim between Kabbalah and Zrika, but I don't remember Kabbalah osaba ve'en li lefarish. I don't remember what that distinction is. So who pipes up now? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva. Ani afarish. I'm going to explain the difference between Kabbalah and Zrika. Kabbalah osaba machshava kemaisa. And now we seem to be reflecting, if I read this correctly, the shita of Rabbi Shimon. Shelo osaba machshava kemaisa. That's Kabbalah. And of course, if we add the logic of Rav Shimon, it's because you can dispense with Kabbalah. Zrika, that's indispensable. You can't circumvent Zrika. Also, b'machshava kemais. Then it becomes an avoda, full-fledged avoda, and therefore, if you have a machshava poselis, it passes the korban. Kiblo bachutz, if he was makabel dam outside the azora, eno chayav koris. This statement of kibul bachutz eno chayav koris is made by Rabbi Tarfon, but interpreted by Rabbi Akiva to say that herein lies a distinction between Kabbalah and Zrika. Because in Zrika, the machshava of, shall I say, shlamim liola or shlamim, or let's take a case of chutz lizmano, all that is a machshava haposelis, osaba machshava kemais. However, Kabbalah and Zrika differentiate one from the other in the case of chutz, because whereas in Kabbalah, if he was makabel adam and he's outside of the azara, then it's kosher. But if he was zorik adam bachutz outside of the azara, then he's chayav kares. What else? What other distinctions can we pinpoint between Kabbalah and Zrika? Kiblu psulim and chayovin alav. Zarku psulim chayovin alav. Now, what chiyuv are we talking about here? If a zar, or for that matter, a kohen who was shikar, he was shasu yayin, or he wasn't wearing his begadim, He's chayav misa b'dei shamayim if he performs the zrika. It's almost as if we're saying that the zar is usurping the special responsibility of the Kohen, and you're a zar, and for that you're chayav kares. With regard to Kabbalah, although it's prohibited, but nevertheless it's not a chayav kares. So ku psulim chayavin alav. Right, let's say you have a Kohen who's a Baal Mum, and he went ahead and he did the Zrika, then he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. And none of this applies to Kabbalah. Omar Rava. Now the Brisa gives you the impression that if he had a machshava aposeles during the avod of Kabbalah Saddam, that would not in any way undermine the kashrus of the karma. And that's against that Mishnah, because that Mishnah says that machshava poseles in any of the four avodos. So it's obviously including the Kabbalah Saddam. Omar Rav lo kasha, kan b'machshavas pigul, kan b'machshavas shelo lishma. And here's the difference between machshavas pigul and machshavas shelo lishma. In our Mishnah, we're talking about a machshavas shelo lishma. And in that context, Kabbalah Saddam shelo lishma would not passel the korban. However, in the Brisa, the case is that during the Kabbalah Saddam, he had in mind a machshavas pigul, which means a machshava of chutz l'zmano. Now, during Kabbalah, a machshava of chutz l'zmano doesn't register. But if it's a machshava of shelo lishma, then even though he had that machshava at the moment of Kabbalah Saddam, the korban is possible. Dekonami. So Rav wants to be medayik to support this. It says the katani shazevach nifsal, below katani mispagil. Right, all the emphasis in the Mishnah is on psul korban, not on pigul, which, as we said before, generates a chiv kares if you eat the meat of pigul. Shmamina says Rava, I want to derive from that our Mishnah is talking about a case where he had a machshava poseles, but not a machshavas pigul. So the Gemara raises the following objection: Umachshavas pigul lo posla b'Kabbalah? Are you telling me that there's a distinction between machshava shelo lishma, which would passel the korban in the case of Kabbalah, but machshavas pigul would not passel in the case of Kabbalah? It's only shelo lishma that will passel the korban. V'asanya, we learned in the Brisa, yachal lo yehei machshava moel sel b'zrika bilvad. I might think that a machshava chutz l'zmano, which is a machshavas pigul, would only be meaningful with regard to zrika. Minayin l'rabo shchita v'kabbalah. How do we know that even if during his shchita or right after the shchita with the kabbalah, how do we know that in such a case there is a machshava poseles? Talmud Lomar v'hem eyachel ye'acham b'psar zevach shlomov lo ye'rotze b'dvar ma'mevim lidei achila kosav medaber. And this seems to be marbe. We have to see where he sees it in the pasuk. Any avodas achila, meaning any avoda that will lead to the achila of the basar on the mizbeach. And that means all the avodas hadam. And if the Kohen, during the avodas hadam of shchita or kabbalah, has a machshava poseles, then that will passel the korban. However, a machshavas pigul of chutz zmana will not passel the korban. I mean, he has a whole discussion here about Reb Shimon. Yochel shani marba af. Shvicha shirai vaktor say murim. Okay, shvicha shirai means whatever's left in the mizrach after the zrika has to be poured on the yesod of the mizbeach. That's a separate mitzvah. And of course, aktoras haimurim means after they zorik the dam, they take the murim and they burn it on top of the mizbeach. So now the Gemara is raising the possibility that a machshavas pigul during these avodos that are not mechaper, the kapara was already clinched with zrika, would also passel the korban. For example, machshavas pigul. Talmud lomer bayom hashlishi lo yirotze hamakriv oso lo yichoshev. Okay, so what's this yalfusa of bayom hashlishi lo yirotze? Zrika bechlal hoisa. Zrika was already included in the kinds of avodos that are matter the achila. Lama yotzes. So why did the pasuk again mention zrika on the third day? Ma zrika miuchedes shi avodas avoda umakeves kapara. Avkol avoda umakeves kapara yotzu shvichas shirayim v'ktoras emurim she'ein makves hakapara. So only that kind of avoda which is necessary in order to achieve kapara, and that of course culminates with zrika. On those avodos, we have a psul of pigul, machshavas pigul. But with regard to shvichas shirayim aktoras emurim, which are not ma'akev the kapara, the Torah is teaching me that machshavas pigul will not generate a psul in the korban. Yeah, but the only thing is, Rashi interprets this Gemara a little bit differently than I did. I have to count out to Rashi, obviously. Rashi is saying that the thrust of what the Gemara is here is saying is that if he has dam left for pouring it on to the soda mizbeach, one second, let me just. Right. What I said before seems to be okay. So the dinam of pigul don't apply. But in any event, what the Gemara wants to get over here is that a machsheves pigul will passel the korban on all four avodos, culminating in zrika, and included is kabbalah. We just had a brisa that machsheves pigul doesn't apply to kabbalah, correct? Let's just go over that one more time. Right, Amar Rava, lo kasha kam machsheves pigul, kam machsheves lo lishma. So during the avoda of Kabbalah, a machsheves pigul doesn't register. And yet here, in this price, we came to the conclusion that in all four avodos leading up to Zrika, as excluding Shvichas Shirayim, excluding Haktar Seimurim, there is a psul of machsheves pigul. So how do we reconcile these two?